Hey there! In this week's video, I'm going to show you how to sew up basic interlinked sprung. So this is a piece that I was experimenting with a pattern on, and I'm just going to use it to show you how to sew up your sprung. And so you might want to sew up your sprung if you want to make a sprung bag or hat or top. There are a lot of different items you can make with sprung if you do sew up the sides or partially or fully. So I'm going to show you just how to sew from the ends into the middle, and I'm just going to use the end thread here. So one thing that you may want to consider when you're planning your project is that if you are going to sew it up, if you know you're going to, then when you go to tie on your warp, you want to leave a really nice long tail. So for my project, this tail is actually just about long enough. And if you had a project that was, rather than 6 inches long but was like 60 inches long, then you want your tail to be about 60 inches long. You generally want it to be at least as long as the entire project. And of course, it doesn't hurt to have a little bit of extra. Okay, so let's get this tail threaded onto the needle. You can just use a darning needle or yarn needle like this. It shouldn't be sharp because you don't want to accidentally split your threads. So we're going to fold our work in half like so and match up the ends. And I don't think I did this piece particularly even on the two sides, but that's okay. And then what I'm going to do is going to try and figure out where I want to start here. So you want to get this into a good position that you're holding it in. So I like to sort of sandwich it between a couple fingers if I can. If I'm working with a much bigger piece, I'm going to hold it more like this. The most important thing is that you keep your edges together and even. And to start with, I'm not going to actually look for what I want initially. I just want to make sure I'm catching these first two loops. So the very first loops, these would have been loops that would have been on your loom, on your end dowels. And it doesn't really matter which direction you go through them. However, the direction you go through these is going to set the direction for the rest of the sewing up. So if you go back to front like this, then you're going to go back to front all the way along. So I'm just going to quickly run those through here, and that's just to kind of get things going. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to look along all of these end loops here, and it's going to be way easier to see, I think, on this back one here. This side here, than this side, because this side's a little looser, but I'll show you on both. So you can, if you look at this, you can kind of see that there's threads that are just sort of twirling or twisting around each other here, and there's all these little loops along the end. So we're going to be picking up every other loop, and we're also going to be looking for a specific loop. And so let's pull the front away and look at the back. So if we look, make sure I have a dark background for this so it comes out. So if we look at this, I want you to look at these end loops. We're looking for this end loop right here. And what makes this end loop different from this one is that where this end loop comes from, it's going to come from behind the loop above it, and then it's going to go down and go behind the loop below it. But if you look at the loop, the loop of thread that it came from behind above, so it came from underneath this loop right here. You see that? It came from underneath here. There's also another thread that came from underneath that loop. So there's actually two threads that came from underneath this thread right here. So we're looking for threads like this. We're looking for two threads that are laying side by side that were worked together. So the reason why we have these two threads laying side by side is because when we work a shift row, the row where we pick two back threads and drop one front thread to begin our row, this is where we picked those two back threads. And then on the next row, and this right here is the next row, so this is the row that was a shift row where we picked two and dropped one. This is the next row right here. So if we look at this end thread, so you'll see that there's just one thread here coming from underneath the next thread up. So we're looking at these end loops, loop, 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 loop. We're looking for two threads laying side by side coming from underneath the loop above them. Here's the loop above, here's the loops we're looking at. So there's two threads side by side coming from underneath the loop above them. And then if we look at the loop above them, there's only one thread coming from underneath the loop above it. And actually it's coming from underneath two loops above it because that's the next set of two threads laying side by side. So once you're able to recognize these two threads that are laying side by side like this, then it's very easy to sew up Sprung. So what you're gonna do, and again, I started by passing my thread back to front. So going back to front, you're gonna catch the top of those two side by side loops, and then you're gonna do the same thing on the other side. So here's the two side by side loops. Do note that on the front, they look a little different because they're coming from the other side of the thread, but if you just turn the work around, it'll look the same. All right, so you're just gonna pull that through and don't pull too tight. And now we're gonna go up to the next set of two threads that are sitting side by side. So there's the one on the back. And then if we look for the one on the front, so here on the front, depending on the direction you're going, this might look more like your back, might look more like your front. But if we look at the front, so here is the two threads laying side by side. So here's the top thread that we wanna pass our needle through. And so you can tell these two, because even though they're coming from behind two different threads up here, if you look down below, you'll see that they're passing behind one loop together as a set. So here is the correct placement for the back. So that is the top thread of the threads, two threads lying side by side. And we're gonna just pop our needle right through these two threads that are laying side by side on the front. And then an easy trick once you've found one of these. So for instance, down here at the bottom where it was a little hard to see, if you weren't sure what you were looking for, you can just go up it a little ways, find one that you can identify, like this one's really easy to identify right here, and then follow this top thread back down. So you see that, let's actually follow it up since I've already done the sewing. So if we follow this guy up, we'll see that it goes underneath this thread, and then here it pops back out, and this is the correct next thread to pick up for your sewing. And then follow it where it goes underneath the thread above it, and then comes back to the edge, and again, this would be the correct thread to pick up, or the two threads that you want to pass between. So you're passing between the same two threads each time. And so you can just follow that one thread that's along the edge. And that's a good way if you're having trouble finding it, you found it in one spot, but you're having trouble finding it maybe near the edge, is you can just go up a few rows, find it, and then follow that same thread all the way back down to the bottom until you find two threads laying side by side, and that it happens to be the top one. Okay, so here is the next set of two threads on the back, and here is the next set of two threads on the front. Okay, and then the next set, those two right there. then as you get near the middle, you may find that it's a little hard to find what you're looking for, but that one was pretty easy. And so there is my seam. And if you look really closely, you might be able to see that there's a little bit, something a little different here. But for the most part, this is a fairly invisible seam. You're not going to be able to see the seam too well. So just make sure that you don't leave it too loose. I might have left this a little on the loose side. And don't pull it too tight, because if you pull it too tight, you're going to have something like that happen. Okay, so there you go. There's how to do a seam in Sprang interlinking. Hopefully that helped you with your project, and thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.